Hi, how's it going? Hello everyone. I'm finally going to be taking a look at the Hone PowerStick 185D. It is a very inexpensive dual voltage stick welder that is rated at 185 amps on 240 volts and 130 amps on 120 volts. It's a fairly simple machine. It does claim to have stick and lift TIG modes. It has an optional VRD setting that you can turn on and off, and it claims to have hot start, arc force, and anti-stick, though none of those are adjustable. I haven't done any welding with it yet. All I've done so far is plug it in and turn it on. But one good sign right off the bat is that when plugged into 120 volts, the amperage adjustment range does go from 10 to 130 amps, and when plugged into 240 volts, the amperage range adjusts from 10 to 185. So unlike many other cheap welders, the display does reflect what the machine supposedly can do on the voltage that it's plugged into. So that's a good sign, and hopefully that translates to it actually putting out what it says on each of those amperages. As far as the included accessories, they're pretty standard for this type of machine. The cables are just a copper-clad aluminum conductor, so they're not actually copper cables. And they have a fairly cheap insulation on them, though it didn't stink like a lot of them do, and it feels a little bit less soft, like I could push my fingernail through it than some of them do. So the insulation might be a tiny bit of a step up from some, but otherwise pretty standard stuff. The work clamp feels fine. It does just have copper-plated steel jaws, but it has a little copper strap. It doesn't feel super flimsy and the spring is stiff, so the clamp is fine. The electrode holder, similar story. It has just a stamped steel jaw on the top, but it does have a cast copper alloy jaw on the bottom, and it has a decent enough spring. Cheap, but should work fine. The power cord is fine. It's 12 gauge. It is a little bit short. It's only about 4.5 feet long, though that is partially made up for by the fact that the cables are actually nearly 10 feet long. So you can't get super far from the wall with the welder, but the cables are decently long, so you're not quite as tied to the wall as you are with some machines where they have, a 3 or 4 foot power cord and only 5 or 6 foot cables. As for the controls on the front, you just have the amperage knob, you have a button to choose between stick welding and lift start TIG mode, and you have a button to turn the voltage reduction on or off. And that just basically changes between the open circuit voltage being 80 or so, or being lower for increased safety. On the back of the welder, fairly standard stuff. Cooling fan, power cord, data tag. The power switch is a little bit odd. It actually looks and feels while operating it like a breaker. So if you just barely put a little bit of pressure on it, it snaps down. But when you go to turn it on, it takes pressure all the way to the very top until it finally clicks into place. It honestly feels exactly like a breaker. Doesn't really mean anything, it just is what it is. Or maybe we'll open it up and we'll find it is a breaker. And with that, let's actually open it up and take a look inside. Well, that's a bit of a unique take on the warranty void sticker. This one says, warning, a void opened. No thanks. All right, now I've got the welder opened up, and one of the first things I noticed is that there are no bleed down resistors on the capacitors. So I got my meter out and checked, and sure enough, even after having been turned off and unplugged for a while, there's still almost 39 volts on those capacitors. So, sooner after it had been unplugged, who knows, it could be more voltage than that. So it just goes to show that you should always use caution when opening anything like this, and you should really only do it if you're comfortable with it. But moving on to other things, you can see it almost does look like a breaker, might just really be a switch, but in that form factor, and it's actually designed to be mounted on a DIN rail, but they have this like custom bracket in there to hold it. Kind of funny, but hey, it works. The cooling fan and the heat sinks, they aren't all that large, but I have seen similar machines with the amount of output that this one claims to have that have, a similar amount of cooling, so hopefully this will put out what it says it does. As far as the components, everything is just kind of haphazardly placed in here, or at least it looks like it. I'm sure there was a reason for it, but everything is at kind of odd, jaunty angles. And some of the wires are run a little bit haphazardly. This one is just kind of tucked into this heatsink, which I suppose is fine. It does have some braiding on it. However, this wire, this power wire, does not have any braiding on it, and it's actually just resting up against one of these very sharp corners of this heatsink. and there is already a little bit of chafing on that wire. Just sitting on a bench all the time, I doubt that that's ever going to wear through. But if this was a portable welder riding around the back of a truck all the time, maybe that'd be a different story. On the back of the board, all of the pins, the excess length from the through-hole components, they are snipped off, so that's good. The board itself is probably about 3/4 of an inch from the side panel, though, there's nothing really to support that side panel or stop it from bending in against the board, so it's definitely better than a lot that I've seen, but there's no insulating sheet, there's nothing like that to prevent this side case from shorting out against that board if it were to get knocked, other than just the fact that it is about 3/4 of an inch away, and this isn't a very big machine, so it's not a real wide span, so it would take a pretty big hit to bend it in all the way. The board itself is grounded to the case. There's no real provisions for the case to ground to the outer part of the case, the outer cover. There's a lot of screws in it. I'm sure it's probably passing enough of a ground through all those screws, but it's not like some welders I've seen where at the very least they have a spot left free of paint so that the outer case can ground to the inner frame or case or whatever. Still, overall, nothing super crusty and nothing stands out to me as being a major problem. Really, the only thing that I kind of really don't like is the fact that this wire should maybe be longer so that it could run a different way so it's not pressing up against this heatsink. But let's get it put back together and do some welding with it. So for starters, let's get a couple of the rather unsurprising negatives out of the way. First of all, it doesn't do very good at 6010. It will run it. In fact, it'll run it better than a lot of the cheap stick welders I've used. It stutters a little bit on the start. It's a little bit hard to get going until the rod heats up. Once the rod heats up, if you keep a tight arc and don't, move it around too much, it will actually stay running. So that is better than most. However, if you long arc it even a tiny bit, it does go out. So if 6010 is your primary purpose, I probably wouldn't go with this machine. If you had to run some 6010, you probably could, but if you're practicing stick pipe welding or something for a test, probably not ideal. Also, it doesn't have fan on demand, so the fan runs all the time, and it is a little bit loud, but it's not a very high pitch, so it's not too bothersome. So, no big deal there. It doesn't have adjustable hot start and arc force, but it definitely has them. I didn't even have to break out the oscilloscope. Hot start especially was very noticeable on starts. It was very much hotter for maybe a half second or so on starts. Very noticeable, no question there. It has hot start, pretty aggressive hot start in fact. Arc force, definitely less aggressive. It doesn't have a super aggressive arc, which honestly I would say is probably a good thing unless you really need that. It has just enough of an arc force setting that it doesn't stick the rod real easily. So, you can get a really tight arc and it doesn't stick, but it's a fairly soft arc. So the arc force is mild. The VRD function works just fine. I did measure it. Open circuit voltage when not in the VRD mode is 75.9 volts. And with the VRD mode enabled, it's actually 13.9 volts. And it's a nice, smooth, steady voltage. It's not kind of jumpy like you get with some other machines. And as far as the accuracy of the amperage output, some of the best I've seen in a welder anywhere near this price. It says it has 185 amps max output. The average is probably closer to like 178, although it does jump up close to 185 just due to the arc force as you go. But either way, very close to what it says it will put out on 240 volts. No problems there. Very pleased with that. And when you turn it down, it really just gets even better. When set at 120 amps, you get bang on 120 amps. Just excellent regulation there. And I turned it down to 40 amps, and I got pretty close to 40. It's not quite as close in the low amperages, but plenty good enough. Very good result. Set at 40 amps, I got about 45. No problem there. And the good news continues when running on 120 volts. It puts out actually just over 130 amps when set to 130 amps. And again, when turned down to 80, gives you right on 80 amps. Excellent result. Turned down to 40, really close again. Very, very good result. I'm very pleased with this welder in terms of that. You can dial in an amperage and know that you're really closely going to be getting what it says. And with the exception of 6010, which, like I said, ran okay, but not great. All the other rods I ran perfectly well. 7018, 6013, 7014, no problems at all. They all started easy due to that hot start. They all ran very smooth. no problems. And I was able to dial in just the amperage I wanted because of that very accurate setting on the machine. Overall, if you want 6010, maybe this won't apply to you. Otherwise, this is a great machine. I would say it's probably the best cheap Chinese stick welder from Amazon that I've ever tested. And that's saying quite a bit because I've tested a lot. Don't get me wrong, there are concessions for the price. The accessories aren't fantastic, doesn't have fan on demand. As we saw, the internal build quality isn't amazing. It's okay, not fantastic. The power cord's a little short. You know, like I said, there are concessions for the price. However, in terms of performance, I don't find anything that's just an outright lie. It does what it says it can do, it does it accurately, it does it easily, and it's just a very easy welder to use. No complaints. So there you have it. In terms of just a very cheap stick welder, I would say that is my new go-to recommendation, hands down. I haven't yet tested the lift start TIG mode on it. I may do that eventually, but today I was just focused on stick testing. But if you'd like me to test that out with this machine, or if you have any questions or anything, let me know down below. As always, thanks for watching. Take care.